Nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back with another episode of Cheap Shots. And on this episode, we're going to show you guys how to get started into Warhammer Age of Sigmar for around $50. Actually, much less than $50, but we'll talk about exactly why it's an even 50 here in a little bit. So, once again, I have to thank one of my viewers. His name is Margarthai Pi. He actually recommended that a video that was made by Sigmar Miniatures, who actually showed you how to actually get into the miniatures wargaming hobby, specifically Warhammer Age of Sigmar, for less than $50. And that video kind of inspired me in order to make other videos using this same challenge, because $50, while may be a considerable amount of money for some people, that money is actually the amount that most people actually pay to go to the movies, or to go out drinking at a bar, for example, or to have a really nice dinner at a chain restaurant or something like that. So because of that, if you're looking for a way to get into miniatures wargaming, specifically with Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and you're looking for a lower cost of entry, $50 would actually be a good place to start off. And the reason why is because in Warhammer Age of Sigmar specifically, not only will I give you a general for what you're starting out with as well, but I also give you 2 battle line units to form the core of your army, and then from there, if you really want to get into it, you could actually build off of it and expand your army, expand your collection, and get into that miniature wargame if you want to. At the same time, you don't necessarily need to use this for Warhammer Age of Sigmar. You could use this for Warhammer Fantasy, or when Warhammer the Old World finally drops, you could use that as a basis for that, or for whatever miniature wargame that you like. And as you can see in this photo, this is what the end result will basically look like for you to get into Warhammer Age of Sigmar. We're going to make you build up a undead army for a couple reasons. One, they're very cheap to get. 2, the paint scheme is very, very simple, because we're going to go for this really ethereal looking paint job. And 3, because, you know, it's undead, and undead is kind of cool to play in any fantasy setting whatsoever. So we're going to go through this and go kind of step by step about how you can get directly into Warhammer Age of Sigmar, or any fantasy game for that matter, for less than going to the movies, for around $50. And so let's get this challenge on the start. So first of all, we're going to talk about items that are available to you for free. So these items are what I like to call the freed items. These are items that you probably already have laying around your house, and these are things that you could actually use to help you with the miniatures wargaming, because we're going to paint up these guys to make them look pretty good. And so some of the things you'll need, of course, are water, which is relatively available. I'm sure you have tap water that you could use in order to wash your brushes, as well as to use for basic materials. Sand, which is, of course, what the entirety of the earth is primarily made up of. Just go outside and grab some sand. For those of you guys who are a little bit squeamish about just digging into the dirt and using that, I suggest throwing it in the microwave for about a minute or 2. It'll pretty much kill anything that's inside of it as well, so it also sterilizes it too. And at the same time, you probably have glue of some sort, whether it be wood glue or simple PVA glue or Elmer's glue, where the situation might be. And we're primarily going to use these materials in order to not only paint with, but also at the same time also put texturing on the bases of our miniatures as well. So that way we don't have to worry about spending money to get that texture paint or whatever the case may be as well. So these are usually the things you just have lying around the house, so you'll need those items, of course, to help you get started into building up your army. Now, the next thing, of course, you need to do, of course, is to get some miniatures. Now, my suggestion to you, if you're really starting to get into miniatures wargaming and you're looking for a very economical way to do so, I highly suggest that you purchase used miniatures. A lot of people who are in the miniature wargaming hobby, sometimes people fall out of it, sometimes people move on to different games, sometimes people want to get a different army. So because of that, there's actually a really good market for some used secondhand miniatures that you can get from other players, for people who are in the game as well. So if you're looking for a good economic way to do so, I highly suggest you do this, because there's lots of people who are always, people change hobbies, change games. Sometimes people change armies as well. Sometimes they play, maybe sometimes they can fall out of the hobby and they're just trying to offload stuff that they don't want anymore. Whatever the case may be, I suggest you go to your local gaming store and always ask around. Usually the manager of the store will usually have used miniatures for sale themselves, or they'll point you to players who are looking to offload things, because people are always on the prowl for used stuff and to offload things that they don't use anymore. So you can find these all the time. Now for this situation, in this one, as you can see, I have some Kings of War stuff. I was actually quite lucky. I went to my local game store. There was a guy who was looking to offload some of his Kings of War miniatures, just because at that gaming store that I was at, there was a large Kings of War presence there, but over the years it kind of dwindled down to almost nothing, because these players have now moved on to Star Wars Legion, I believe is what the game they're playing now. So because of that, some of these guys are looking for ways to get rid of the old miniatures, that way they can use that money to buy new stuff for Star Wars. And this situation, this guy had about 50, I think it was 48 to 50 used skeletons that he had, and so he wanted to get rid of them pretty quickly. So one of them was actually fully assembled. You have like I think 20 of them fully assembled. The other 30 I think were like in a box like you see here in the picture here, and some were partially assembled, some parts were missing. It was a kind of like a little madcap collection of things. So because I was able to get that from him for about 25 bucks, so I was able to get that situation right there. At the same time, I also went to the local game store, and this guy was also, the store was actually selling a used White King for $50 as well. This was the old Warhammer Fantasy version, so he didn't have the square base. He just had the he was still on the square base, not the round bases that Warhammer Age of Sigmar uses. So because I was able to get that guy for $5 as well, and that's where most of the money for this build is coming from, is actually $30 dedicated to miniatures. And to be quite frank, when it comes to starting an army, that is what you should actually spend your most of your money on, is on miniatures. If you find yourself in a situation where you're spending more money on brushes, glues, and paints and primers than the actual miniatures themselves, then you're doing something wrong, in my opinion. So that's the reason why, if you're looking for a way to really, get into the hobby, get into it cheaply, this would be the way I would go. Go look for used miniatures. Sometimes, garage sales will have some stuff as well. I remember this one time I went to a garage sale and this guy was selling Battle Masters, which was a great game to have a lot of different types of miniatures for Warhammer Fantasy, and I used that to do that, and it cost me like $5. So always prowl around, look for whatever deals you can. Once you get your miniatures, next thing we gotta do now is start going to our local Dollar Tree for some tools. So the next cost we're going to talk about now are tools. In this case, I went to my local Dollar Tree to look for tools used for miniatures. You'll need something like a pair of side clippers, as well as a pair of nail clippers, as well as a hobby knife. You can usually find these for about $1.25 a piece at your local Dollar Tree. These ones I actually have had for a while now, so I just kind of included that just because I didn't feel like going to my local Dollar Tree to buy new tools since I already had them on hand. They're not the greatest quality. As you can see right there, my side clippers are broken right there, but they get the job done, and that's exactly what you use it for. These side cutters are good for cutting things out of sprue, for example. The nail clippers you could use for trimming up your sprue as well. If you want to carve out the mold lines, you could use a hobby knife to do that as well. Me personally, I don't like using hobby knives to cut off mold lines, just because I have really bad luck with knives. If you look at my hands, they're all scarred up from all the times I've cut pieces of my hand off or cut myself in some way. So because of that, I like using side clippers and nail clippers for that job, just because it's a little bit safer, and you won't slip with a hobby knife and slice yourself open and have to go to an emergency room, for example. So those tools will cost you about $1.25 a piece. At the same time, you also want some paintbrushes as well, and I recommend the Dollar Tree to get some really good packs. As you see here, I got some extra packs here. I got one for a 3-brush set. I have another one for 7 and another one for 2 brushes. And I purchased, you actually only need the one with the 7 pieces in the middle of it actually, but I bought the other ones because I wanted to use them for other things like dry brushing larger pieces of terrain, etc. So that's the reason why I have those items. But all you really need is the 7-piece one right in the middle there. And when you combine all these tools together, it costs about $7.50 in order to get all these tools assembled. Now, some people who paint with miniatures will say that using cheap brushes is actually not very good because the quality of the brushes are not that great. And I can see where they're coming from in some situations, but for people who are just starting out, you don't really need any high quality brushes or professional grade brushes to paint your miniatures with. You're just starting out. So, and the way that we're going to do the paint scheme with these guys using an ethereal paint job, using cheap brushes are going to be perfect for it because there's not that much detail going on when you're doing these this ethereal paint job that we're going to go with. So because of that, always go with cheap brushes if you can. After all, if they get worn out, they get frayed, you can always keep them and use them for things like applying glues, or for applying textures, or for dry brushing, or a million and one different uses for your messed up tools. So with that being said, now that we got the tools, the brushes, next thing to do now is talk about craft paints. Alright, so when it comes to painting up your miniatures, I love using cheap craft paint. So here's some examples of some cheap craft paint that I like to use. For example, you have to go to your local Walmart to get most of these things, and that's a double-edged sword for going to Walmart for that, but that's where usually I get most of my paint from. This is because cheap craft paint does exactly as advertised. It's good for using on miniatures, and it's very, very cost effective. They come in a wide variety of colors, and the best part about them is that they're extremely cheap. Apple Barrel Paints, which is the product type of paint that Walmart sells, comes in 2 fluid ounce bottles. They cost you about 50 to 60 cents per bottle, so very, very economical. The larger ones, like that Peter Gray one, which is the 8 fluid ounce, I believe is like $3.99. The Folk Art, I think, is 75 cents at your local Walmart because it's metallic paint. So getting different types of chief paints to do this is actually perfectly fine. Now, the naysayers out there will say things like, they don't have a strong pigment as the more expensive paints like Vallejo or Citadel or Army Painter, and that may be the case, but the thing about that is that they're significantly cheaper. They're usually about a tenth of the price. Especially if you look at things like contrast paints or speed paints now, that's all the rage, which I don't really understand because all that is just ink mixed with ink mixed with matte medium is all it is. But anyway, so because of that, people will like to tell you to get the more expensive paints, and the problem with that is that if you get those expensive paints and you add up the cost of them, in some cases the paints actually cost more than the miniatures themselves. And like I said, if you're spending more money on paint than you actually are on the miniatures, you're doing something wrong in that situation. And that's the reason why I like using the cheap stuff, because it's really, really easy. Now, granted, professional painters or competition painters use more expensive paints. Sometimes they use cheaper paints. It just kind of depends. But those people are professionals and they're competitors as well. So they'll use whatever tool that works best for them in order to get the desired result that they want. So that's perfectly fine with those guys because, like I said, they're professionals. And so they'll use whatever they need to get the job done. But for someone who's just starting out, maybe you've never put paint before on miniatures at all, cheap craft paints is a perfect way to start out, because let's face it, if you mess up and you're starting out, at worst you're out 50 cents in some situations. Okay, so that's the reason why I recommend cheap craft paint, just because it's almost foolproof, it's not very expensive, and if you don't like painting your miniatures, then you're not spending all that much money on stuff that you'll never use again. So that's also a nice aspect of it as well. So now that we got our tools, now that we got our supplies, and we have our miniatures, next thing we need to do now is start painting them up, and let's go ahead and talk about that step. So the first thing you're probably going to do is you're going to assemble all your miniatures first, and after you get them assembled, the next thing you want to do, of course, is to add texture to the bases, and this is where your sand, water, and glue comes in earlier. You're just going to throw some glue directly onto the bases, and you're going to dust them with the sand that you got outside, and once that dries, what you're going to do is you're going to then wash them with a combination of water as well as glue mixture. I suggest you mix your water and glue to about a 50-50 consistency, so 1 part glue to 1 part water, and mix it together. It will have about the same viscosity and consistency of milk is what it looked like, and that's perfectly fine, because then you just take that mixture, apply it all over the texture on your bases. Once it dries, it creates a really tight seal for your texture to stay on your bases, and then you can go ahead and proceed there from painting onto it. And as you can see, these next few slides coming up, I'm just going to just breeze over the talking point. This is how you pretty much go about painting up your miniatures, especially if you're going to do this ethereal paint job design. All you need to do, of course, is to prime your miniatures in flat white primer. It's going to cost you $4 from Walmart. Just make sure you get a good even coverage of that primer all over the miniature. And then from there, what you're going to do is you're going to do what's called glazing on your miniatures. Now, if in case you're wondering what glazing is nothing more than taking paint and watering it down, is basically what it includes. So all you got to do, of course, is take a cheap craft paint, mix it with some tap water, about a 50-50 mixture in my opinion, so 1 part paint to 1 part water. Now, it is going to dilute the pigment and the concentration of the pigment of your paint, but that is perfectly fine, because to create this ethereal look, what we're going to do is we're going to put layers of translucent colored paint on top of that white undercoat that we spray painted on earlier. And what that's going to do is that these darker colors is going to go into the recesses of the miniatures, while the white undercoat will show through these layers of paint. And that's perfectly fine, because that's what's going to create this really cool glowing effect that you guys saw at the beginning of this presentation. Because that white ethereal glow is how you do it. You do it through glazing. Now, the problem with glazing, of course, is that glazing is a very boring way of painting. Alright, so be gentle with yourself and be patient on this part, because you're going to have to put multiple layers of this glaze on top of your miniatures over time, okay, to get the desired effect that you want. Sometimes it'll just be 3 coats of paint that you need to put onto your miniatures. Sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 5. For my situation, it ended up being about 5 coats of this. So once you get done painting your miniatures, whatever shade you want them to be in, using this glazing method, just move on to the next one and just do like an assembly line of painting, really. And granted, the assembly line is kind of boring, but that is the fastest and most efficient way of actually painting up these miniatures, using that glowing effect. Now, as time goes on, of course, and once this glazing effect is completed, you'll notice that the miniatures actually look kind of one-dimensional. I mean, it's cool that we made them ethereal and all, but they're not as interesting as other painted miniatures, in which case, that is when I recommend you actually start painting the metallics of the miniatures. So these guys are carrying weapons, they're carrying shields, they're wearing suits of armor. So the best way to make it look more interesting, in my opinion, is to actually paint the metallic colors on it. What this does, it gives the effect that it looks like these spirits are actually walking around and possessing cast off weapons, cast off armor on the ground, and they're kind of like embodying it. So it looks like you have these floating suits of armor with weapons walking around, just slicing people up apart on the battlefield. And so to do that, I would like to use what I like to call my graveyard steel technique. It's just, you just take the gunmetal gray from folk art, you mix it with some copper paint from folk art, and a 50-50 mix. It kind of creates this kind of brownish, copperish, dark metallic color that looks like it's rusted metal, and it looks really, really cool. And if you add some brown wash on top of it with using some burnt umber mixed with water, it looks really, really awesome, and it looks really great at the same time. And of course, you could also pick out some gold elements if you want to make them look really awesome as well. And then from there, of course, you could just hit up the bases with that English Ivy green, like I'm showing it in this video, and then dry brush with successful layers of green, and then rim the bases in palm leaf, and then you're ready to go as well. And so this is a very economic, very cheap way, and very fast way of actually painting up these guys to make them tabletop ready and actually use in your battlefields. Now, granted, are these going to win any competitions? Probably not in terms of painting competition, but if you're just painting up stuff just to put in your local game store, or to play with your friends, or to make it look a little bit more presentable when you play, then by all means it's perfectly fine. And like I said before, when it comes to the craft paint that you guys are going to use for this, all told, your paint, your primer, your primer is going to cost $3.99. Your paint's going to cost $6.40. You're going to spend about roughly a little over $10 painting up your miniatures this way. And you're probably going to spend more money at a Taco Bell or a McDonald's for lunch than you actually will for actually the paints that you use to paint up your miniatures. And so that's one of the nice things about this cheapskate method I like to use so much, is using cheap craft paint, because it's very economical and you get a pretty good result. So like I said before, this is what the end result's going to look like. Now, oddly enough, when I was adding all this up together, it ended up being significantly less than $50. It ended up being $44.89 is what I ended up spending in order to paint up these guys to make them look like this. Now, of course, if you want to make it to an even 50, this is where I kind of cheat to make it $50 even. I decided to charge myself $5.11 for gas, for gasoline that I spent driving around getting these things, and then, you know, that's what I did. So that's how cheap this method is. It is so cheap, in fact, that not only am I saving you money on the materials that you're using, but I have enough money in here built in for you could actually, you know, buy gas, all right, in order to start up this army. So that's where our grand total of $50 come from. I couldn't think of anything to spend $5.11 on, so I just, you know, gasoline, that'll do it. And as you can see, this is what the end result will look like from these different angles as well. And there you go. That's how you can get into it for $50. Alright, you guys, so here we are. This is the end result of the $50 challenge for Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and this is what it looks like. We have 50 skeleton warriors here, all painted up with this ethereal paint job. At the same time, looks like these spirits are carrying around hunks of rusted graveyard steel. That's what I like to call it anyways. So yeah. This is what you guys can get if you want to get started in Age of Sigmar, Warhammer Fantasy, or whatever fantasy war game that you like, for about $50. So we have enough here to give you 2 units of skeleton warriors, as well as a character to lead them, with command groups. So they look really awesome. At the same time, they got this really cool ethereal glowing paint design as well. It's also why this build was so cheap to make, because the colors that we need are not very many. Very basic, easy to paint system, just using glazing in order to get the same effect that we wanted. Just mixing paint and water and just layering it upon layers to get that really cool effect. Now, the movement trays, of course, are something I built on my own. I mean, you can build your own movement trays out of backstock as well as some foam, fun foam. That's what I used to build mine out of, but I didn't include that in the cost because I didn't, you know, Warhammer Age of Sigmar doesn't really use movement trays too much. So that's why I didn't worry about that. Oh, sorry about that. Let me get zoomed in there. There we go. So that's the reason why I didn't include that in the cost, because, you know, I'm using this for Warhammer Fantasy Battle myself. If you guys are interested in actually using how to build really cheap and easy movement trays, I got cheap shots to show you how to do it. I actually use backing board and fun foam, sand and wood glue, and cheap craft paint to do it. And that's another reason why I also adhere to using cheap craft paint, because it's very easy to use. It's very, very cheap. You can get some really good results on it, and at the same time use it for your wargaming hobby. So for the price of a nice dinner out or a night out at the movies, you can get yourself into Warhammer Age of Sigmar, Warhammer Fantasy, or whatever fantasy game you want. Pretty simple, pretty cheap, and has a really good result. Now, of course, if you want to spend more money afterwards and increase the size of your armies and so on and so forth, that's perfectly fine. But if you're just looking for a way just to get started, this is my guide for getting into Age of Sigmar for 50 bucks. So once again, thank you to McGarthai Pie for recommending the very first of the $50 challenges that I did for Necromunda. I'm now doing this for a lot of different things like terrain builds and army starting and all that kind of stuff. So thank you very much for giving me the idea to do this with this $50 challenge. So that's good news with you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this week, guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.